In 1968, especially 1972, Richard Nixon was elected and reelected, appealing to a silent majority of Americans unhappy with all the social changes of the late 1960s. Um, in particular, attracting at the presidential level Southerners unhappy with Johnson's support for civil rights and turning the country's political dialogue in a much more conservative direction. Even if he sometimes undertook some moderate or even liberal policies, among other things, cutting the last connection between the US dollar and the gold standard, which the US dollar had not been fully based on for some time, but which it had been convertible to, at least for purposes of foreign trade, um, until Nixon cut that last tie, what's known as the Nixon shock, late in his first term, temporarily destabilizing the world economy um, and contributing, along with his insistence the Federal Reserve cut interest rates, to the economic problems of the 1970s, which saw inflation coupled with recession, a very unusual combination, a very unpleasant one. Nixon also, despite being a conservative and anti-communist Republican, made made openings with China, visiting China himself and improving American relations with them, and using that to put pressure on the Soviet Union, who no longer got along with China despite both being communist, to also build better relations with the United States out of concern the US and the People's Republic of China would team up on the Soviet Union, creating a period of détente that would last for the rest of the 1970s. Nixon began reducing our troop commitment in Vietnam while stepping up our bombing campaign, eventually creating a peace agreement with South Vietnam and North Vietnam separate independent countries, although with a secret promise by Nixon that should the North ever invade the South, the U.S. would be right back in with heavy bombers once more. A promise that could not be kept once Nixon was out of office. Because despite his many accomplishments, which might leave him remembered as one of our greatest presidents, he's remembered instead as one of our worst because of his own paranoia, engaging in any number of dirty tricks, illegal activities, harassment of his enemies and perceived enemies. Of course, most infamously, um, arranging or at least condoning the wiretapping of the chairman of the Democratic National Committee or Convention Committee, who was headquartered in the Watergate Hotel and office complex during the 1972 presidential election, a completely unnecessary action, considering Nixon would go on to win that election by the biggest margin in the electoral vote in our nation's history. But as investigations of the Watergate break-in got closer and closer to the president, with Tennessee Senator Howard Baker asking perhaps the key question, what did the president know and when did he know it? Nixon was forced to resign before articles of impeachment could be voted on, which surely would have forced him out of office. Now, Constitution doesn't say the president can resign, but it doesn't say that he can't. Nixon was followed really by a moderate Republican, Gerald Ford, with a Republican from the liberal wing of the a vice president from the liberal wing of the Republican Party, Nelson Rockefeller, whose followers were even known as the Rockefeller Republicans. Although Ford felt forced to drop him as his vice presidential candidate in favor of a more conservative vice presidential candidate when Ford tried to get a term of his own unsuccessfully in 1976, when he was defeated by Jimmy Carter, who ran as a Washington outsider, having experience in Georgia politics, but being by training an engineer and never having served in Washington, except possibly as part of his naval career. Um, but while he would support some liberal policies, in many ways he would be much more conservative than, say, Lyndon Johnson. He supported spending cuts to try to balance the budget. This still being a time when, for the most part, the U.S. government felt if we were going to spend money, we needed to find at least most of it somewhere. He supported deregulation, saying later that the greatest accomplishment of his presidency was deregulating the airlines. Um, And while he supported affirmative action and appointed more women and minorities to his cabinet than any previous president, there were those who were said he should have done more. Although some people are never satisfied on both sides of the political spectrum. Um, Carter, despite some impressive successes with the Camp David Accords, bringing a measure of peace to the Middle East, um, also saw some pretty significant foreign policy failures. The Iranian Revolution was a bad moment for the United States. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan brought an end to détente, that period of improved relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And while these things were not necessarily Carter's fault, the president is always blamed for what goes wrong. And unquestionably, he did not handle them especially well. I'm not sure anyone could have, but I'm sure he did not. And certainly the taking of over 50 American hostages by Iranian revolutionaries, whom Carter was never able to free, was very strongly held against him. He was replaced by Ronald Reagan, who of course maintained support among conservative, moderate, and liberal Republicans, saying the 11th commandment was to never speak ill of a fellow Republican. He also attracted many Democrats, particularly those who were socially or economically conservative, a group known as the Reagan Democrats, and was sometimes called the Reagan Revolution. So that while I would tend to put the beginning of the 6-2 party system at Nixon's election, some will put it with the Reagan Revolution of 1980. Democrats in 1984 would nominate a fairly liberal candidate, Walter Mondale, and the first woman to run for vice president, Geraldine Ferraro. But Americans were in a more conservative mood, re-elected Ronald Reagan by the biggest margin in the popular vote in American history. And he was followed up by his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who, although at heart was fairly moderate, adopted largely conservative rhetoric, as again, that was the feeling at the time. And it was he who got to lead the country during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the downfall of communism across Eastern Europe, as well as leading the United States and really the entire world through the first Gulf War with Iraq. Indeed, saying that America and the Soviet Union and Europe, even France, cooperating, Israel and Arab countries cooperating to defeat the aggression of Saddam Hussein was evidence of a new world order. Indeed, some historians would propose that we had reached the end of history, that the great questions of capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship had been settled, with the good guys winning, that being us. And for some time to come, the world would seem to be governed by a Washington consensus in support of democracy, of free trade, and the things that had made America so successful for at least the past 50 years, arguably our entire history. And while George H.W. Bush was not reelected in 1992, I think largely unfairly, due to a poor economy and what was seen as an inadequate response to the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles during his presidency, the Democrat who replaced him, Bill Clinton, although promoting early on some fairly liberal policies, particularly massive health care reform nicknamed Hillary Care, because his wife Hillary was to be in charge of it, or at least of kind of promoting it to the American people and designing it, and proposing integrating homosexuals fully into the military before compromising on a don't ask, don't tell policy. There's a lot of backlash to this, and Clinton, in many ways, ended up governing in a much more moderate way, although he was often not given credit for that by conservatives. Indeed, he said the era of big government was over. Something you cannot imagine Lyndon Johnson, for example, saying. Something Franklin Roosevelt might have said early on, and did say when running for the presidency against Hoover, but certainly did not act upon. But Clinton, would take a more moderate stance, especially after the midterm elections in 1994 during his first term, when many Americans, unhappy with his seemingly liberal policies and attitudes, turned against him. And in particular, Southern Democrats, but other Democrats too, switched en masse to the Republican Party. And while some Southerners had voted Republican since 1964, at the presidential level, they had tended to still elect Democrats to Congress, to state legislatures as governors, and some continued to do so. But many of those Democrats simply became Republicans. It was sometimes called a Republican Revolution, promising to further limit government in their contract with America. Clinton did adopt a number of popular Republican policies: welfare reform, a balanced budget, and so got the support of a number of Republicans, although certainly many opposed him, even shutting down the government to make a point. And so Clinton might be remembered as a pretty good president, as the economy was good, in part because of his policies, in part because of policies from George H.W. Bush that were continued under Clinton, in part just to for the peace dividend, as the world no longer had to spend on military equipment as we had done during the Cold War, and could now spend on and invest in consumer goods. Clinton is not remembered as a good president, in large part, like Richard Nixon, because of his personal lack of morals. Clinton being followed throughout his career by accusations of sexual harassment, marital infidelity, and finally being impeached for lying under oath about a relationship with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky, something that came up in turn as part of the sexual harassment lawsuit brought against him by Paula Jones, dating to the time when he was governor of Arkansas and she was an Arkansas state employee. Later, that case, a civil case, was settled out of court, with Clinton paying over $900,000 to settle it, most of which went to Paula Jones' attorneys, of course. And so, although Clinton was not removed from office as a result of his impeachment trial, it nonetheless tarnished his reputation and further diminished Americans' trust and respect for the presidency. And so, even though the economy was good when Clinton's second term ended, his vice president, Al Gore, did not really run on his predecessor's record or ask Clinton to campaign for him, saying instead that he would restore morality and integrity to the presidency. His opponent, George W. Bush, son of former President George H.W. Bush, promised a compassionate conservatism, and was elected despite not quite winning the majority of the popular vote. And his electoral win has been debated to this day, there being a number of irregularities in Florida. And this election was ultimately decided in the Supreme Court, which stopped a recount of ballots in Florida. A recount that was eventually concluded unofficially, and which still showed that Bush would have won Florida based on the ballots cast, although there were some questions about whether some voters voted as they would really have chosen, there being some complaint that the Florida ballots were hard to read. Some heavily Jewish counties did vote for Pat Robertson, who in the past had said during World War II, we should have supported Hitler because Stalin was even worse. I'm not sure how many elderly Jewish votes that would have attracted, but who am I to say? Bush governed, and with much conservative rhetoric, although largely ignoring, as Republicans had kind of ignored ever since the days of Ronald Reagan, the promises to balance the budget. Following the September 11th attacks and Bush's decisive invasion of Afghanistan, he became very popular. The later invasion of Iraq was less popular, especially as the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan turned out to be much, much harder than the invasions that had led to the occupation. Furthermore, Bush was seen as not acting quickly or compassionately in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and also was blamed, perhaps with some justification, for the Great Recession of 2008. All that had roots dating back to decisions made both during Bill Clinton's presidency with Republican support and George H.W. Bush's presidency with Democratic support. But in 2008, Bush, of course, could not run for reelection. Um, and Republicans nominated, in some ways, a more moderate candidate, John McCain, although only in some ways more moderate. The Democrats took a shift in a more liberal direction, nominating the first African American presidential candidate, Barack Obama, who ultimately won in large part by promising more government spending to alleviate the recession. All that had already begun under President Bush, and promising massive health care reform, which ultimately was brought about, although not nearly as extensively as some had hoped. Um, and Obama would also undertake some other liberal policies, although not as many as some liberals hoped. But it would certainly be a shift in a more liberal direction in American political discourse, but with a very strong reaction against that as Republicans became even more right wing. And so I believe the sixth two party system probably came to an end either with the election of Barack Obama or at some point during his presidency.